Production of Now This and the Appeal. Today, we are discussing Austin City Council's vote last week to cut its police budget by a third. So that's about $150 million of the original $434 million Austin police budget. We're joined by Austin City Council member Greg Casar, who crafted the plan to redirect police funding towards supportive services. Also joining us are Chaz Moore, the Austin Justice Coalition Executive Director and co-founder, Emily Garrick, Managing Attorney of Policy and New Initiatives at Texas Fair Defense Project, and Chris Harris, the Director of Criminal Justice Programs at Texas Appleseed. Thank you each for being with us today. So demonstrations have gone on for months, with people across the globe protesting police brutality against people of color and demanding change. Demonstrators in Austin are calling for accountability and change after a slate of recent police-involved killings. Mike Ramos was killed by the police while pulling out of a parking spot. And just recently, protester Garrett Foster was shot by a civilian driver who drove into a crowd of people marching to defund the police. The recent release of video footage of Mark Ramos's encounter with the police has sparked a rallying cry across Texas. Now, Austin has a higher percent of police shootings in response to mental health calls than any of the other 15 largest cities in the country. And the Austin Police Department has faced criticism for racism, prompting a Black sergeant, Tanya Jefferson, to speak out publicly against the internal culture. A grassroots movement calling to defund police and reinvest in social services with another $130 million in reductions over the next 2 years. To date, the announced 33% reduction is one of the largest percent reductions of a police budget anywhere in the country. Texas Republicans have announced opposition to the plan and are vowing to take action in response. Republican Governor Greg Abbott, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, and Speaker Dennis Bonnen are in Fort Worth today, announcing a proposal related to the police funding. So let's get started with our discussion about the plan and about what comes next. So turning first to you, Council Member Casar. Thank you for joining us. You were the lead sponsor on the plan to reduce the police budget that ultimately passed City Council. Can you tell us what the proposal does and how you got it passed?
Oh, thanks for having me, Summer, and thanks to everyone in the movement who has been pushing for changes in policing like never before. I represent the lowest income district in Austin, the one that faces more violence than anywhere else in our city, even though our city is, along with San Jose, one of the safest cities for things like homicides of anywhere in the country. But we know that there are still real public safety issues haunting our community. But the status quo of just growing and growing police budgets has continued to fail us. We know that mass incarceration not only comes as a major civil rights failure, but it also makes us less safe. It actually doesn't address the core issues of inequality or violence or harm in the community. And so if in past budgets, we made small proposals to maybe cut 300,000 here or $1 million there from the police budget, and have never been able to get it done. And just last week, by unanimous vote, we had this major transformation of our budget because community members stepped up to the plate. They marched, they protested, but they also made phone calls. They also had council meetings. They went to our town halls and basically came up with a package of things we wanted to reinvest into. Because we know that just having more and more cops driving up and down the street doesn't prevent family violence that's occurring within people's homes, which is actually the biggest chunk of our violent crime. And we haven't added a family violence shelter bed in our city in years. And so we were able to cut some police overtime or cut a police cadet class in order to open a new family violence shelter. We know based on what you just shared that we have more people with mental health issues getting shot by police in our city per capita than almost anywhere else in the country. In fact, we had David Joseph, a teenager whose family lives here in my district, get killed when 911 was called because he was having a mental health crisis and was a unarmed naked teenager in the street. I'll never forget how horrible that is. And we want to create a city that is safe for everyone and safe for teenagers like David, safe for people like Mike Ramos, safe for people that have died either at the hands of police or who have been killed in other ways. And so we have transferred that money, tens of millions of dollars, out of excessive over-policing and into COVID-19 response, into substance use care, into gun violence intervention programs, things that will actually prevent a 911 crisis before it even happens. So we're trying to take public safety and civil rights more seriously than we ever have before. And we're trying to lead the country in doing that.
Thank you, Council Member. So given all of these steps and everything that is going on in Austin to move public safety and civil rights in a different direction, what do you see as the next steps in the coming months and really over the next couple of years?
We have to do a couple of things. We have to keep on going down this path of taking more and more responsibility away simply from a police response and building the alternatives. How do we get to a place where we have mental health responders going to every behavioral health crisis that's better handled by professionals? How do we start looking at things like protests? Why do we, when there's protests against police brutality, why do we escalate those with riot police and people showing up on horses instead of having a new set of public employees that are making sure that people are safe when they're exercising their First Amendment right and not necessarily having to make things escalate? How do we start to have conversations about addressing the root causes with different solutions? So I think this is just the beginning, because it's taken decades to create this system that we have. And we know we've got to take big, bold transformational steps, but also step by step start showing that we can come up with alternatives. The other big thing is we have to be ready to fight the backlash in cities like Austin, where we know that there's continued fear mongering, where people are going to say that we're making things more dangerous. And we have to find a way to bring everybody together around this idea that the way we've been doing this just doesn't work. And so, as you mentioned, the governor and lieutenant governor, instead of having a press conference about how they're going to address COVID-19, which it has such an alarming positivity rate here in Texas, instead of talking about how they're going to keep our teachers and kids safe from COVID, instead of announcing support for the George Floyd Act that was recently announced, named after Mr. Floyd, who's a Texas native, instead of those things, they are having a press conference to fear monger about what's happened here in Austin. And that we're going to keep seeing that in our cities. So we have to both hold our local electeds accountable, and then when they do the right thing, figure out how to hold on to those gains and advance them.
Thank you, Council Member. So Emily, turning to you, you've been involved with campaigns in Austin and across Texas. So you are very familiar with movements for change. Now, the council member mentioned Governor Greg Abbott, and even in advance of his press conference that's set for later today, he issued a statement opposing the Austin City Council's decision. Now, how does this proposal fit within the larger landscape of reform in Texas more broadly? And at a local level, how does it fit into the Democratic-led city of Austin?
Yeah, so thank you so much. And yeah, I saw that statement, and I agree that at both the state and the local levels, we need to be thinking about public safety over politics. And this was in Austin a step towards increased public safety. And the question, I think, is what does public safety mean to the people of Austin and to the people of Texas? And the answer is that in Austin, people are realizing that public safety for them doesn't mean having this huge police budget that's more than the budget for EMS, public health, libraries, parks, courts, and housing all put together. And they're seeing that police don't actually prevent violent crime, and less than 1% of the calls that police respond to are violent crime. So why do they get all of this money for all these non-criminal duties that we don't need them for? And a lot of people in Austin on both the left and the right are recognizing that we have a really truly horrific legal system that's less about protecting and serving, and more about targeting people of color and criminalizing poverty. And people are watching the videos of all the police brutality against peaceful protesters in Austin, And they're seeing that there's no accountability. Officers aren't being disciplined, even when they're shooting Black and Latinx children in the head with these lead munitions and then shooting at the first responders. And they're realizing that at the heart of all of the problems with our criminal legal system in Austin is policing. So it's a question of what we want police to be doing and what other people should be doing instead, and what nobody should be doing. And at the local level, this was a funding decision, and that should be done at the local level because it's about the city budget, and that's just how it should be. And so in Austin, we're reinvesting in these alternatives to policing, like Councilmember Pizarro outlined. And really, it's actually, I think, fairly common sense and modest. We're not laying off a single officer, even though polling shows that Austinites are willing to lay off officers in order to invest in these alternatives instead. We're funding these alternatives, we're making modest cuts, and we're moving some of the programs out of APD and into different departments, and that's it with no layoffs. So again, what Austin has done is really important, and it's groundbreaking, and it's more than a lot of other places. But at the same time, right now we're cutting completely only 5% of the budget and funds that can actually be immediately reinvested into other priorities. And most of those cuts are from a hiring freeze until we redo the really problematic trainings that APD has, and from cutting empty positions that APD can't possibly fill, which is, I think, very common sense. So at the state level, though, we have the same question, which is, what do we want police to be doing, and what should other departments be doing instead? And what do we want to make sure that nobody is doing? And I think that last part is really important at the state level. We want to make sure that nobody is allowed to murder people. Nobody is allowed to shoot children in the head when they're just standing on the hill and shoot them with a modified shotgun. And so one of the biggest issues there is accountability for officers that hurt people, because right now state statute creates nearly insurmountable hurdles to disciplinary action against officers, let alone firing them for misconduct or even prosecuting them in many cities. And so at the state level, we need to end qualified immunity. We need to rewrite our civil service statute. We need to make sure that Texas is a safe place for everybody. And a great first step for that is the George Floyd Act that was mentioned. And I really hope that both Democrats and Republicans can see that.
Thank you, Emily. So it sounds like there's a lot of ground for this movement to cover.
Yes,
so,
absolutely.
Turning to you, Chris. Now, you've said that these reforms would position Austin as a leader in the movement to defund policing across the country, and that they set up options to dismantle Austin police. So can you unpack that a bit for us? What do you think the impact of these reforms will be? And how does this proposal help set up further dismantling of the Austin police?
Sure. Well, first, I think it's important to put the cuts into context. We have a long way to go to realize that full $150 million in savings. And so it's that figure is aspirational in many ways. There are, however, real hard cuts that were made today, and even just considering those, again, Austin is currently a leader amongst particularly the biggest cities in the country with regard to cuts to police budgets since George Floyd. What will the impact be? The impact will be in more people experiencing homelessness, having access to supportive housing, more people in medical crisis receiving more timely help from an expanded emergency medical services group, more people in other forms of crisis being assisted by a larger group of community health paramedics, more survivors of patriarchal violence receiving support so that they can begin healing and future harm can be prevented, more people receiving food assistance, rental assistance,
Know if Chris just froze. So maybe he did. Okay, so I believe Chris just froze. So let's keep it moving. So Moving next to you, Chaz, you've called for a $100 million cut to Austin's police budget, and you previously protested a smaller $11 million cut proposal. Now, how do you view this new plan? Does it meet the demands that your organization has called for? And what do you think needs to be done next?
Well, thanks for having me. I'm sad Chris has been lost in the internet ethos. Hopefully he can rejoin us. But yeah, so the original cut, the 11.3 million cut, that was really way less than that. Once you start doing the number crunching, was something that we felt. And I'll speak for AJC, Fair Defense, Appleseed, and Just Liberty, because those are the groups that we were working with. You look at the $11.3 million cut right in the middle of this national movement, this national moment to where, we literally had protests of some size and stature in every state in the country. And then to come back with such a minimal, and I don't even know if minimal is the right word to describe how small that cut was. And I think the 100 million or the at least 100 million, because that's what we framed it as, right? We thought that at least 100 million could signify to people that this is a step in the right direction, right? I think most of us here on this call believe that we can actually get to a world where we don't need police, because we understand the origins of policing comes from catching enslaved Black folks as they tried to run away and achieve or regain their humanity. And then when you look at the history of policing, almost in everything that is bad, the Holocaust, the enslavement of Southeast Asians, with the British Empire, like policing has always been a part of that problem. But I think going from 11.3 million to this awesome plan that Greg Casar and all the other council members came up with is definitely a step in the right direction, because it shows us that we can have different approaches to public safety, right? It shows us that, maybe, just maybe, we can listen to the experts that tell us forensics shouldn't be in police departments anyways, right? Just maybe, like things will be okay. The sky won't fall if we don't have 911 in APD, which doesn't really make sense anyway, right? So I think as we're trying to move towards this nation that is truly equal and equitable, we have to let some of these old ideologies go and these old philosophies. And policing is like a really, really big crux of that, right? It's always been the thing that keeps the status quo in line. And as we, again, try to get to like this place where, women can be paid equally and Black people can just live, breathe, and exist. And, you can love who you love, no matter your gender or your sexual orientation. We have to like really undo and unplug and unhinge ourselves from these white supremacist, racist institutions such as policing. So, and I think it's important when cities show that they're willing to do that by reinvesting and divesting resources, right? Because it's like this old adage in the Bible, right? Like where a man's heart is, like so is his treasure, right? So if you really say in a city of Austin where we have all these people that say Black Lives Matter, women matter, all the rights for everybody, we have to start showing what our resources, like Greg Casar and like other city council have done by saying, you know what, let's take a large chunk of this money and try something new to show our communities that they actually do matter.
Thank you, Chaz. So it sounds like, this proposal is a step on the path towards true liberation. So thank you. And Chris, sounds like Chris is able to join us back again. So it's wonderful to have you back. And you were telling us what your thoughts are about the impact of these reforms and how these proposals will help to further dismantle the Austin police.
Sure, yeah, and I'm sorry about that. I don't know where I got cut off, but as I was saying, the impact, especially in the reinvestment area, is substantial, right? There's going to be more people experiencing homelessness, having access to supportive housing, more people in medical crisis receiving more timely help from an expanded emergency medical services group, more people in other forms of crisis being assisted by a larger group of community health paramedics, more survivors of patriarchal violence receiving support so that they can begin both healing as well as future harm can be prevented. More people receiving food assistance, rental assistance, the list goes on. So I think there's substantial benefits to the reinvestments right away as far as the impact. As far as contributing to future dismantling, I think one of the other things that did not create new money for reinvestment, but that I think will prove crucial, is moving specific units out of the police departments, specifically 911. And I believe Chaz was referring to this a little bit. Moving the 911 call center out of APD gives us the opportunity. Now, there's still work to be done, but to change the mindset, change the culture of that organization, to understand more about what's going on with emergency response in our city, and to ensure that those folks are really sending the best folks to answer calls that will do so without the threat of violence, without the threat of escalation, or the threat of jail and incarceration to all instances in our city as is possible. So with the knowledge and with the skills there, we can begin to really address the emergency needs and the harm in our community through non-carceral means. And I think there's also a fund that's been set up and a work group that's started meeting that is reviewing additional ways to draw down on policing and to invest in other areas. We'll have yet to see what comes out of it, but I think there's a lot of promise there, again, to continue to pull, to divest from police and to reinvest that money into communities, which is ultimately what we need to do to address the root causes of the issues that have really been brought up and that has driven so many to the streets. The racial injustice that we see plainly in policing, but that infects really so many parts of our society. And again, as Chaz mentioned, what we need to do is actually move resources around to meet those needs, to meet those challenges.
Thank you, Chris. So my next question is for all of our guests, and it speaks to what Chaz was discussing and what Chris has been mentioning. So a report from the Justice Collaborative Institute with Data for Progress finds that 3/4 of voters support a community health corps, with healthcare experts responding to 911 calls and providing critical support like contact tracing and community health support. Another report shows that 7 in 10 voters support violence interruption programs. So the new Austin Police budget cuts would go in part towards funding violence interruption and community health responder programs. So what do you all see as the ultimate role of these programs relative to police for Austin's public safety? And Councilmember Kazar, can you please start us out for this question?
No, I mean, it's no surprise to me that polling shows such overwhelming support. I've never seen in 5.5 years on council, and then years before that as a community organizer, this many people get involved with Austin city politics. We had, just in the week of the protests at the end of May, beginning of June, over 20,000 Austinites reach out to my office alone. So there is just there's been a political sea change that has happened as people recognize that we can actually cause great harm and have caused great harm by thinking that policing is the primary tool of local government to address any situation. And we just can't do that anymore. Police aren't trained or built to be the primary responders to everything. And the idea that jailing and incarceration are going to be the solution to homelessness or a substance use crisis or to mental health or inequality just doesn't make any sense. And so we are really on the cutting edge of how do we create new systems. And so in part of what we passed in this budget is that when you call 911, we will get to a place this year where you hear, do you need fire, police, EMS, or mental health? So that we have mental health response. And how do we have responses that aren't just crisis response? How do we get to someone before the crisis? We have a hotline for family violence survivors in this city. It's called our Safe Line. And the stories are tragic and horrible about the people who are on a wait list because they don't want to get to that crisis situation. They're calling, but they've been hit. Had violence against them, but their lives, for example, aren't under threat. And so they can't get into a shelter bed. I mean, we are in some ways just by virtue of funneling so much of our resources towards prisons and policing, starving ourselves of the resources needed to prevent the crisis in the first place. So we need alternative crisis response. And then also we need to start thinking about, why do we have so many crises?
Thank you, Council Member. Emily, what are your thoughts on this question?
Yeah, so I completely agree. We're very excited for the violence prevention and mental health first responders. We've seen that APD in particular is just the opposite of what you want to see on the scene in those situations. So I'm sure that we're going to see so much better results from this. And I'm glad voters are recognizing this. And I just want to pick up on what Councilmember Kassar said about why we're seeing these crises and issues in the first place. And I think that that's why it was so important for us to not only be investing in more traditional alternatives to policing, like mental health first responders and violence prevention and interruption, but also in wellness programs for the community, because so much of the criminal legal system right now is about criminalizing poverty and traps people in this cycle. So we're really excited to see what these first steps yield.
Thank you, Emily. Now, Chaz, they said you first started talking to us about this. So in your kind of ideal world, what do you see as alternatives to policing and the role of alternatives to policing in the next 5 years in Austin?
You know, like the more I think about this, the more I realize too, like, you know, we're not really doing anything new, right? Like there was a time in real life history where police didn't exist. And you know, it's when you look at the overall idea of everything, police in the form of institution at least is a relatively new thing that hasn't worked out very well. So, you know, I think for me, in my wild, crazy, you know, kind of Chaz the philosopher type of way, it's about really understanding that public safety is more, or has to mean more of an investment in each other than into systems, right? Like to me, public safety means that if we have a system or systems that let people know that they are seen and that their needs are valued and are able to be taken care of, then I think people will tend to less likely be involved in what we consider crime, right? For the most part, people commit crime or some type of violence because of something that's lacking within, right? Like if Chris is poor and hungry, he might go rob somebody, right? But if Chris is not poor and hungry, the chances of him engaging in that type of activity are extremely less, in my opinion, right? I'm sure some academics and whatever folks can debunk that with whatever science they want to use. But I think the conversation that we're having in Austin, and not only having, like actively engaging in with stuff like the vote, is saying, you know what, let's try public safety as a holistic approach, right? Like, why is it that police show up to mental health calls when, like, we know they're not trained to do that, right? When we have the other option is people that go to school 4, 5, 6 years, right? Let's try that approach. And then also, you know, I think another thing is we have to talk about the trauma. You know, for people of color and poor folks, there's a certain trauma that just comes with policing, even if this officer, you know, is a good cop, right? If I'm driving and I see that police car pull behind me, things are already happening in the mental, just because of police. So I think it's all about how do we get to this place to where we have the response to the crisis, indeed, yes, but also how do we become proactive in approaching public safety to make sure the needs and concerns and health and well-being of the community is served, right? Because policing is after the fact, right? Which, and I have to say this, and I'm done talking, but like this notion that police keep us safe is false, right? We call 911 after the bad thing has happened. Like the very presence of police very seldomly stop bad things from happening, right? That's contingent upon us as a community, as a society, how we can collectively give to public safety. But police do not prevent crime in this mass way that a lot of people on the right and, you know, these far right people want us to believe. The only way we can prevent bad things from happening is by being more in community with one another and investing in alternatives to public safety and really expanding the definition of what public safety actually means.
Thank you, Chaz. And Chris, do you have final thoughts on this question before we wrap?
Sure. Yeah. To expand on what Chad said, I think, yes, there are things that we need to replace that the police are currently doing today, find alternatives for those things. We have to also understand that a lot of what police are tasked with doing by the laws on the books, as well as many of the things that they simply do on their own, aren't needed, aren't legitimate, are harmful. And so I think it's important for us to completely reorient when we talk about public safety. In Austin, we've had over 300 deaths from the coronavirus, more than we would see die from murders in 5 or 6 years. This is a public safety crisis. What will help us down the line in 5 years? It's going to be more housing for low-income families. It's going to be public health that can respond to and ensure and prevent public health crises. It's going to be food and rental assistance to keep people in their homes and to get people who are currently experiencing homelessness back on their feet and into housing. So these are the things that we need to do to really promote public safety in our communities. And I think what we'll see is that the need for policing, the perceived need for policing, goes away. And to those Republicans who are now about to present about this, I think that they're not doing that because they're afraid that this isn't going to work. I think they're doing it because they're afraid that it will. And so we have to prove that it does, and I'm confident that we will.
Thank you, Chris. And for my final quick question, Chris, you mentioned the fact that the governor is doing a press conference right now about his response to efforts to defund the police. And I would love to know what you all would say to our viewers in terms of giving them hope and giving them guidance on how to move forward despite what the governor has said. And Emily, can you start us off with that?
Sorry about that. Yeah, I think that we're going to be seeing really great results from what we've been doing in Austin. This is a really, really important step. And I think also like, again, a really common sense step, and everyone should be fighting to continue this progress and doing that at both the state and the local level. I'm feeling very optimistic and excited for what's ahead.
Thank you. And Chaz, what hope do you have for our viewers to keep pushing this movement forward?
I think my hope is, like kind of like Greg said, I feel like at the beginning of all this, I thought this was just going to be another moment where, people did the protest for like 2 weeks and then, they took the Instagram thing and they was done. But it seems that we're in a transformational state in this country. The fact that so many of our white allies are actually seemingly leaning in to learn about not only why racism sucks and why it's bad, but why we need to completely undo it, right? And the same thing with men, right? I think men are leaning in and trying to unlearn, patriarchy and toxic masculinity. I'm hopeful because I feel like for maybe the first time in this country, we're not just like letting a bad moment become like this 6-month phase, right? Like 9/11 was a 6-month phase where we sung "Proud to be an American" every day in school for like 6 months. The Boston bomber, like we have these moments where we pseudo come together. But I think now we're going through this transformational change, and I'm excited to see what comes out on the other side. And I think what gives me hope is people like this that I work with, and councilmen like Greg, that yes, we are in the system, but we're working very radically within it to try to like build something new. So, and Black women, right? As long as Black women are here, I think we'll be okay. So,
yeah, I agree with all of that. So, Chris, what are your thoughts?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? My connection hasn't been great.
No problem. So my question was basically in light of the fact that you mentioned how the governor is speaking right now on his response to efforts to defund the police. What can you say to our viewers to really give them hope and to keep the momentum up, to say that we are continuing down this path together?
Wow. Well, I think that wow, that's a good question. What I would do to give people hope is to say that, I think the protests themselves how people have come together in the last few months, the mutual aid programs, the deep organizing that's been done. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, all the groups in Austin that have been so instrumental, in addition to AJC, DSA, Undoing White Supremacy, CCU, GRL, that have really propelled this movement forward and this work forward, not just this year, but in the past. These show how as a community we can support each other, how as a community we can come together, we can sustain these movements, we can provide service and support and help and aid together to folks struggling in our communities through this pandemic and the economic crash. And if we can do that in this, then some of the most difficult times, any of us have faced, then we can continue to do that in each and every one of our communities with smaller and smaller police forces. And I sincerely believe that. And I would say that as well, again, we're giving 25, a third, 40% of our local budgets to policing today across this country. If that money were reallocated into direct service support and community-based programs to really assist people in need, we can actually avoid a lot of what, again, people believe we need the police for, and what the police are actively engaged and involved with today. And I always throw out about 3/4 of the folks that are charged with crimes in Travis County, where Austin is, meet the federal definition of poverty. What the police are in so many of our communities is a poverty patrol. And were we to eliminate that poverty, then we would also see the need and the perceived need for policing in many of our communities go away. And so I'm dedicated to that project. I believe that we can do it. And I've seen amazing work in communities around this country in the last few months that I think further prove that.
Thank you, Chris. Now, moving last to Councilmember Kazar, what are your final thoughts to our viewers to just give them hope in the face of anticipated opposition?
Nothing that is transformational and worth fighting for comes without the backlash, comes without the retaliation. In now 5 years, I came in as an elected official at age 25. And so I've learned a lot. But a lot of what I learned was the stuff that we always suspected, which is that politics so often goes to what's the path of least resistance, to what's easier. And so, if you're in the movement work or in political work or policy work, and you're just getting pats on the back and there's no one that's angry, then you're not doing the work right. If we are truly transforming and pushing back against a culture that created mass incarceration, a culture that has relied on institutional racism and classism and patriarchy, then there is going to be that pushback. And that is the next step, is to get things passed, to create the kinds of coalitions of community members and elected officials of goodwill to actually transform our budgets, and then to power through what is inevitably going to be fear-mongering and lies. That is a necessary part of transformation. That is what we've seen every single step of our way through our history, has primarily been young people and young folks of color and women of color stepping up to transform our country, and then the inevitable pushback. And we just have to know and push people to recognize that we want to be on the right side of this thing, that when we look back on this years from now, that everybody, ask your elected officials, do you want to have been on the right team? And I think I feel very confident that that's what we are trying to put together here in Austin. And that's what people can do across the country. And because what we put together is, like, as we said, something that is big and bold, but also that transitions over time. This process, that's what we crafted together. And I think that that's what we need to see in more and more cities across the country. So go and tell them that Austin is doing it, and call your mayor and council members and tell them to do it too.
Thank you, council member. And it's definitely about building a movement. So thank you to all of our guests for joining us today for this informed and very important conversation. The briefing will be back again live tomorrow, where we will be talking to members of Congress about saving the Postal Service. So we hope to see you all there, and have a good and safe day. Goodbye.